It's the Growing for Market podcast.
There's so many soil-borne pathogens that are kind of ubiquitous, but sometimes the environment gets just right, or you have a susceptible plant and you'll have patches of this. And as long as you have nice firm tissue, it's not rotting away, I'd rule out diseases. It sounds like they've already done that because they've said it's just being hollowed out. It looks like it might be ants, right? So for a really long time, and this is a huge mea culpa on my part as an entomologist, and I'm going to be so bold as to speak to other entomologists in my field, for a really long time, we said, no, ants don't do that. It's something else. And you're seeing the ants and you're blaming the ants. They were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. I actually don't think that this is true. I think ants do every once in a while do that. And because us generalist entomologists who work with lots of different groups of insects, for whatever reason, we kind of stay away from ants. And I think that even people who study ants, they're kind of their own creatures because ants are so fascinating. They're just the most amazing things. They're quite difficult to identify because they have so many different life forms in their caste system. And sometimes, if you find a male or you find a worker ant or you find this, you'll have different rubrics of how to identify what species of ant you're talking about. So that's something that, to be honest, I just never bothered to learn because I was like, ants don't eat plants. They don't bite our plants. What are you talking about? But come to find out, there's a couple different groups of ants that will attack vegetable crops in a couple different circumstances.
Hello, and welcome to the Growing for Market podcast, where we talk about growing, marketing, and the business of growing flowers and vegetables for local markets. I'm Andrew Mefford, your host and the editor of Growing for Market magazine, proudly celebrating 35 years in 2026 as the magazine by and for vegetable and flower market farmers. If you're enjoying the podcast, just wait till you see the magazine. Go to growingformarket.com for more. Also, if you could give us a follow and a rating, it really helps other like-minded people find the podcast. And now, let's take a minute to hear from our sponsors. It's with their generous support that we can bring you the podcast for free. This episode is sponsored by Nifty Hoops. Nifty Hoops designs and builds high tunnel systems for growers who want dependable results. What stands out is that Nifty Hoops tunnels are complete systems designed by experienced builders with the details worked out ahead of time. That means the core components are included from the start, like end walls, ventilation, doors, baseboards, and double-layer poly, rather than being added later. The tunnels are designed for real wind and snow loads, efficient assembly, and long service life. You can choose a self-build kit with guidance from written manuals and videos, or a community build where Nifty Hoops works alongside you and the project gets completed in one day. Nifty Hoops has built more than 1,500 hoop houses across the country, including many funded through the NRCS High Tunnel Initiative. They're known nationwide for predictable outcomes and ongoing support. If you're planning a high tunnel project and want it done right, you can learn more at niftyhoops.com. Seven Springs Farm Supply is a farm-based supply company focused on serving market gardeners and has been in business for 35 years. Their catalog includes a comprehensive selection of approved for organic fertilizers, pest and disease controls, growing mixes, cover crop seed, and more. They offer custom fertilizer blending and seasonal cooperative purchasing opportunities, and their experienced team is ready to help guide you to the best solution for your farm's needs. Growing for Market listeners are eligible for an exclusive discount. Visit sevenspringsfarm.com/GFM or give them a call at 540-651-3228. That's sevenspringsfarm.com/GFM for an exclusive discount. Today, we have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Anna Wallingford back to the Growing for Market podcast. Dr. Wallingford is an entomologist with over 20 years of experience conducting applied research. She is the founder of New Hampshire Community Supported Research, a nonprofit organization that conducts trial research in service of local agricultural communities. And if listening to people talk about bugs and diseases through your pod radio is your thing, Anna also has the Serious Grower podcast that is always interesting for keeping up on the latest with pests and diseases. So find that one wherever you get your podcasts. So, Anna, without further ado, welcome back to the Growing for Market podcast.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yes. Well, it's always a pleasure, but I should mention that this podcast is really like the second part of a podcast we did a few weeks back. We got the bright idea to ask growers what bug problems they were having and then ask you how to deal with them. We got a bunch of questions via social media, and I thought we could probably cover them all in a podcast episode. But the last time we talked, we got about halfway through the questions after an hour and a half. And as much fun as it would have been to do a 3-hour-long podcast episode, that's a lot of talking and quite a commitment on the listener's part to dig into a 3-hour episode. So we serendipitously decided to break at the halfway point and come back for the second half of the questions, which is what we're doing today. So in the last episode, we talked about allium leaf miners, tomato leaf miners, leaf-footed bugs, cucumber beetles, flea beetles, aphids in high tunnels, potato beetles, and slugs. So before we get back to growers' bug questions, what's going on with New Hampshire community-supported research in the Serious Grower podcast? I just want to give you an opportunity to update us because I know you have field research and you're doing podcasts. So you got all kinds of stuff going on.
Man, we're doing all sorts of different things. I'm throwing a lot of spaghetti at the wall, but I think the story about Serious Grower podcast, I think it is going to be the place for people who want to get really down and dirty in the details of things because, we covered a handful of topics on our last episode and we got really down and dirty into it. And I think part of that is because everybody's situation is so different. And it's not just like go out and get something to spray and you don't have to worry about it anymore. Every situation is different. Everybody's process is different. Everybody's market is different. Where you live in the country, you're going to have a different suite of pests and their beneficial insects. So that's why every time I have a Serious Grower podcast, I'm really putting a solicitation out for people who want to do a super tech support question with me. So if anybody wants to reach out and they have a very specific question and they don't mind having a quick conversation on the phone or over a Zoom call and don't mind being featured in an episode of Serious Grower podcast and kind of work through this nitty gritty, because a lot of times I don't understand the question well enough to answer it. And you never know, there might be a solution for you, or you might have a solution for somebody else. And it's kind of the narrative research approach that we're trying to take at New Hampshire Community Supported Research, is that, maybe it's not a trial research, maybe it's not a lab experiment, but you never know, we might learn something.
Yeah, we might learn something. And that's why I appreciate having a real live entomologist. I appreciate you coming back third time. Yeah. In fact, you've tied for the most podcast appearances now of anybody. So we've done almost 200 episodes now. We've had a few people do 2. You and one other person do 3, but I think it's just hearing from all your experience that's so valuable, because I think, as we may have mentioned before, I feel like so many answers in agriculture are it depends. And so I was thinking about how so many, I feel like most search engines these days, you put in an answer and the first answer they show you is the AI answer, because obviously they're trying to get you to go live in their AI ecosystem or whatever, be like, oh, they have, and ask the questions to Google instead of asking the extension agency or whatever. And while the answers aren't always wrong, context is so important in ag answers, and which is, I think, what you're getting at. And so I just chuckle sometimes because I think all the AI is doing is looking at what has been said on this topic and picking one of the possible answers, which, as a human, you have to ask, are we in the field? Are we in the greenhouse? Are we in Mississippi or are we in Manitoba?
Right.
There's things are going to be different. And so, because I've been noticing sometimes, because I Google a lot of pests and disease issues, right? As between growing some stuff myself and editing the magazine, I have to look into this stuff and make sure, fact check it a little bit and all that kind of stuff, right? So I noticed that the AI answers that I'm getting, and a lot of times they just seize on the most, I think they're seizing on the most repeated answer, which might work for the majority of people because maybe they're growing it in that particular environment. But also with our audience of market farmers, a lot of them are growing crops in all different environments, right? And so we have to tailor the solution. So that's what I appreciate you coming back to the podcast to give us the human insight on all these things.
The human insight, and anybody who enjoyed the last episode is going to get more of the, well, I don't know, but I think this is what's going on, and more questions than answers. So more questions.
Right. Well, and it gives them a place to start. Like if nothing else, it's like, oh, I have this thing that's eating my this and I can't even get a handle on it. And so getting a foothold on some of these pest problems is a big part of the game.
Yep.
So actually, I do want to ask a follow-up question. So last time that we were talking, so I realized that I should have asked a follow-up question in the last interview about bugs coming back worse after being sprayed. Because in the last interview, I was telling you about an example in a nearby greenhouse, very big greenhouse, but it's also very close to my house, where they sprayed some pesticides, I believe it was for whitefly, and took out both the whiteflies and the beneficials alike. But when the bugs came back, it was the pest species that came back stronger, to the point where they had to take out the whole crop, start over. It was a disaster. Mm-hmm. And so I think I was telling you how I thought it was because when the bugs came back, there were no beneficials left to keep the baddies in check. So they got out of hand. And there might be some of that, but you spoke of a phenomenon where sublethal doses of pesticides will encourage some pest species to actually reproduce more. And so this was a new idea for me, and I wish I had followed up then, but I now have the opportunity to follow up now. So my question for you is, does this terrifying phenomenon have a name? And do you know why they come back? Or what you said, it spurs them to reproduce more. The sublethal dose makes them reproduce more. Like, do you know why that is?
Yes, it does have a term. And hormolygosis is the term.
Hormolygosis.
I think that's right. Or hormesis. So something that is important to keep in mind is that like a sublethal dose, we're talking about the kind of pesticide that would remain as a residue on the plant. So if you are using a product that's registered for use in organic systems, chances are very rare that you would have. So basically, if you think about if you spray a product on your crop to knock back that pest population, some of those pests are not going to be exposed to that spray because spray coverage can never be perfect. And maybe they'll get a sublethal dose of that and they'll come back rearing. But I think where this comes in is that animals that they were somewhere else, they come in and they are crawling over a treated surface and getting that sublethal dose. That's where that phenomena might come in. And that's often seen in like pyrethroids. So where the organic version of a pyrethroid is a pyrethrum, so the natural version of that neurotoxin, so the pyganics, anything that has a pyrethrum in it, that material has a very, very short life on the plant. That active ingredient breaks down quite quickly. So it's less likely to be a phenomenon that happens if you were going to be using organically certified products. This is more something that's like a broad spectrum neurotoxin that has a little bit longer of a residual life. So where, it's possible that a little bit of that might be happening with pyrethrums, it's probably not what's driving the ship. It's probably that lack of predators. It's lack of parasitoids that are causing that problem. Does that answer your question?
Well, yes, and no. I want to know, do you know why sublethal doses would make, like what you just said, why would sublethal dose make them reproduce more?
It's a stress response.
Oh, okay.
Yep. And I mean, not to get too graphic, but oftentimes we will see insects trapped on sticky traps. So, for me, for sampling reasons, we'll use sticky cards or sticky balls or, a yellow thing or a clear thing that's covered with a sticky something such. So insects are either attracted to that using visual cues or they blunder into it. And oftentimes when we are observing those sticky cards, we're using dissecting scopes so we can get a really close look at things. We will see that like an insect will lay a bunch of eggs or an aphid will lay a bunch of its offspring because it's in a stressed position, stuck dead to a trap. So reproduction is a stress response.
Oh, okay. That's so interesting. I guess that's why it takes 3 hours to go through this many questions. But I love that you can bring a more informed perspective, because I think we talked about this last time, how I feel like there's the first level of the question is, why am I seeing more of the baddies post-spraying? And you would say, there's a reaction where they're reproducing more as a stress response to sublethal doses. Oh, and that's the second layer of the answer. I'm like, one explanation is because they got a sublethal dose of pesticides. And then the second layer of the answer is, why do they reproduce more when they get a sublethal dose of pesticides? Because I don't know about you, but for me, it's interesting to us commercially because knowing how to deal with these insect pests is part of our livelihood, but it's also, from the nerd perspective, it's also just interesting how this stuff works. And so I appreciate you bringing that, spending a little extra time and bringing the second or third level answer in.
Right. And I don't know the exact history of the research on this, but if I had to guess, if you study the field of biocontrol, so the study of animals eating other animals for an ecosystem service, anybody who works in that, they're often tracking populations of pest insects against the populations of their natural enemies. And we always expect there to be like a big jump in population of the pest followed by a jump in population of the biocontrol. So there's this like kind of lagging thing where the pest is thriving, the pest is actually attracting the biocontrol into that area, and then they're reproducing and thriving because they have something to eat. And so you'll have these kind of like chasing populations. So they expect there to be this natural population goes up, biocontrols show up, population of pests goes down, and every once in a while that didn't match. And I think that's where they found out, like, oh, there's two things going on. It's not just that the biocontrol is missing. It's that this is growing a little bit faster than we expected based on our modeled population relationships.
Yeah. Okay. That is very interesting. And thank you for that extra level of understanding. Because, I would think people got to keep that in mind, especially if they're spraying. You said it's the pyrethroids that are the synthetic?
Yeah, pyrethroids. I would say if we're talking about a greenhouse environment or a high tunnel environment, there's not a lot of pyrethroids that are registered for use in those systems. So that kind of goes into another conversation that we were having last time too, which is if you have a pest in a protected environment, you are controlling for lots of things. There's lots of benefits to being in a controlled environment like that. Less rain means you have less fungal disease. There's all sorts of benefits to that, but the control that you exert on that means that you have to control other things too. So it's a kind of a push and pull. So we've been talking a lot about this question of like, how do you control pests in this environment? Do you go the biocontrol route? Do you use a chemical control? How can you put them together? And a lot of the times people are looking at biocontrol and saying, oh, that sounds very intensive. That sounds like a lot of information. Can't I just spray? And it just sounds like it takes the same level of stick-to-itiveness, right? So you do have to go in and continue to maintain that control on more time points throughout the season than you think you might. So, after someone's done all their homework, they might find out, well, actually, I have to go in and spray once or twice a week versus like if I started early and doing biocontrol early, even though that sounds like a lot, maybe it's equal or the same, or, I'd rather not be the one doing the spraying. It's a thought experiment for sure.
Yeah. And now let's take a minute to hear from our sponsors. It's with their generous support that we can bring you the podcast for free. If you grow for market, performance is everything. That's why so many farmers are turning to Burpee's Farmers Market. Dedicated to professional growers, Burpee is now offering non-GMO seeds in larger quantities, bred and selected for standout flavor, strong yields, and the kind of visual appeal your customers crave. All farmers market varieties are trialed at Burpee's Research Farm in Doylestown, Pennsylvania, where expert horticulturalists test for germination rate, vigor, disease resistance, high yield, and consistency, things that make a difference in the field and to your bottom line. The seed assortment includes USDA certified organic varieties, Burpee bred classics, heirlooms, and exciting new introductions. Burpee's been doing this for 150 years, and they're still creating new varieties with growers like you in mind. You can check out the full lineup at burpee.com/farmersmarket. That's burpee.com/farmersmarket. And now back to the show. And that's a trend I feel like I'm seeing growers go more and more to biocontrols in greenhouses, even the ones who aren't certified organic and don't necessarily have a problem with spraying, just because of things like that incident that sparked this whole question about how, like any controlled environment, you're not going to kill, like, let's say your target pest was whiteflies. You're not going to kill 100% of them, especially like this greenhouse is very big. And so you can imagine like acres and acres of tomatoes, you're not going to ever get 100% control. Right. And so it seems like even growers who don't care about the organic or chemical aspect would just as soon spray have realized that biocontrols actually work really well in greenhouses, and that there's other things like knocking out, like I feel like most growers, even if they're not certified organic, are trying biocontrols to keep their pests under control, which I mean, as an organic grower myself, that's the way I like to see things going anyway. It's like, oh, there's like biocontrols actually work really well in a greenhouse, and there are a lot of circumstances. And so
I think whitefly is the perfect example of this dichotomy that we're talking about, though, because anybody who has had a whitefly infestation in their greenhouse tomato will be like, oh, I never want to live through that again. I'll do anything to avoid it. Where someone who's never had that experience before, it sounds kind of unbelievable that they'll talk to their, biocontrol specialist, and they're going to say, we're going to put this thing out here, this Incarcia or whatever, and we're going to put it out every couple of weeks, and it's just going to be part of the program. And if whitefly shows up, it'll be there to take care of it. And if whitefly doesn't show up, what's the, like, depending on where you're at, that sounds like a very expensive way to approach a problem, unless you have that visceral, I never want to deal with whitefly ever again kind of problem. So it's kind of like 6 of one, half dozen of another. I can't tell somebody what's the best way to go. It's like, would you rather have a waiting army of Incarcia in case whitefly shows up and you're willing to pay for that and spend the time to do it? Or do you want to, risk it and have to be playing catch up later on in the season? I think that's really a personal preference.
Yeah, definitely a personal preference, but I feel like I see even pretty conventionally minded growers investing in biocontrols.
Yeah, I agree.
In greenhouses.
And they're getting more and more accessible too. I mean, every conversation I've had with the folks who, are suppliers of this, they're incredibly knowledgeable. They are very willing to work with people of different places. Like if anybody's resistant to like getting on the phone with a supplier, don't hesitate. Take the time to talk to them. I think it's well worth it. And these people, they know what they're all about.
Yes, absolutely. As I think I'm trying to get somebody from one of the IPM companies to come on and basically tell us about what they recommend through the year, right? Because like you're just saying, like they know by regions of the continent, what's going to show up when. So yeah. I feel like it takes a lot of the guesswork out of it, because they'll be like, oh yes, you're going to get whiteflies in this month, you're going to get thrips in this month, and the aphids are going to get bad in this month. And so you need to start applying, this beneficial before that to take care of that.
Yeah, they definitely have great advice when it comes to tunnels. I think in open culture, it's harder. They might be a little bit more like, oh, I'm not really sure. Like you could try this, but no guarantees it's going to work. I have been speaking to a couple people. I'll connect you with the people I've spoken to recently.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, I'm working on some people. The more the merrier.
Yeah.
I have yet to get a commitment out of anybody. So yeah, that'd be great if you want to.
Well, especially since they're all coming from different places, like us being on the East Coast, we just don't have as much support as somebody in the West Coast. So even though, you'll have a supplier that's assigned to our region, it is hard to tell whether or not they'll be comfortable speaking to an East Coast grower.
Yeah, although just given that GFM, we've got subscribers in all U.S. states and Canadian provinces and territories last time I checked, it's like we do try to, like, even if somebody were just a West Coast specialist, I would talk to them because we have a lot of subscribers on the West Coast. Yeah. So IPM specialists, if you're listening to this and want to come on the podcast and tell us what beneficials you want to send people and when, give me a call. Let's talk. And maybe that whole sensing that death is impending and it's time to reproduce, maybe that is a fairly constant across life forms, because super quick aside here is I'm working on a greenhouse growing course with some friends of mine who have Orisha greenhouse automation up in Quebec. And so one of the things that we talk a lot about is plant steering. So I don't know, since you're a bug person, tell me if I'm telling you things that you already know here. But like one of the things that we talk a lot in that course is how to get your plant to put its energy into the right part of the plant. And so mainly, I think because Dutch people have studied like every single aspect of tomato plants, like almost every action that you would take on the plant, temperature, amount of water timing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Pretty much everything you can do to the plant has some kind of an impact on the plant. And if you're trying to make the plant put more energy into its fruit, anything that stresses the plant is going to make it put more energy into the fruit. And so we talk about this a lot as far as trying to balance your plant out, as far as continuing to make the vine and leaves for future harvest, but also, putting some energy into the fruit. And so that does make sense if you thought you were not long for this world, like time to reproduce. So a really quick example of that would be like if you like a very constant warm temperature makes the plants think they're going to live forever. They think it's like summertime. So like if you were to grow your tomato plants at 75 degrees day, night, that would be a very unusual thing. But, you could make that happen in greenhouses, right? So if you just grew them at a flat temperature profile, they would actually grow faster than they do under the temperature profiles that we recommend. But they would put a lot of that energy into leaf and stem growth, and with a reduced fruit load. And so even though the temperatures that we recommend with a day nighttime differential, yes, the plant actually grows a little slower than if you grow at 75 all the time, but it's going to put a lot more of its energy into fruit because it doesn't think it's in the middle of summer in South America. And it thinks that it's going to have to hurry up and reproduce one of these days. So aside, I'll shut up.
No, but that's totally on line with what we're talking about, because there's two different things when you're talking about like crop load management is essentially another thing that we think about too, and that's important with perennial crops. But I usually think about these environmental triggers in two different ways, right? So one is just an energy input output kind of thing. So a lot of the times when I'm thinking about plant defenses and we're thinking about like constitutive secondary plant metabolites, when we're talking about secondary plant metabolites, those are all the chemicals that plants make to defend themselves against my insects, right? And so if they call them secondary metabolites because they're secondary to the primary metabolites, which is like the carbohydrates and the proteins and all the things that they need to make more plant and make more fruit or whatever you're selling. So if they have to take that energy to make their secondary plant metabolites to defend against insects or this, that, and the other thing, they're spending less energy on what we want them to do, right? So that's one thing, is like that economics of the plant and taking its nutrients and turning into things. But then there's something else, which I think what you're talking about, which is triggering some seasonality. So if you have something that triggers, like we think about bolting in some of our vegetable crops that are sensitive to bolting, is that they are adapted to northern climates that have winters, and they take winter very seriously, and they want to make sure that they're in the right life stage to go through winter, right? We're anthropomorphizing things in order to make it make sense to us, but a lot of the times that kind of stress makes it go, oh no, is winter coming? Like, did I go through a whole summer and I didn't know it? And that's why they put up their flower and they reproduce, right? So when we think about insects, they have these like diapause triggers. So we'll have certain species of moths that we think might be responding to the change in seasons in a way that our seasons are much longer, and they are fooled into thinking they have enough time to complete another generation. And they kind of get caught with their pants down in the fall, where they have a bunch of new caterpillars, a bunch of new babies, and boom, it's cold. So as much as we think we know what to expect with warming temperatures, like, some insects thrive in all these heat, and some insects lose out because of these like weird seasonal shifts. So I think there is something to be said about understanding how insects respond to stress, how plants respond to stress. But stress is just a generic term for something the plant doesn't understand, right? Like something's out of whack. And sometimes it's a hormone signal, and sometimes it's just they ran out of energy to do what they need to do, right?
Yeah. Okay, well, cool. That's because that's what the thing in the tomato plants is what I thought of when you told me the thing about the thrips or what,
Yes.
reproducing when they get sublethal. So yes, that's the stuff that I enjoy hearing about. And they did a survey. Constituent secondary plant metabolites is what people want to hear about on podcasts. So like this one's going to
Really?
be
All
great.
right.
Well, I didn't actually know that they existed until a minute ago, but I've already learned my thing for the day. So,
well, unfortunately, in a lot of plant families, an upregulation of secondary plant metabolites is not a good thing. So in brassicas specifically, if you are upregulating their chemical defense, it makes it more bitter, more spicy, more not so tasty. So it depends. It really depends. I wouldn't want to challenge a plant to make more glucosinolates, unless of course you're growing it for that very spicy mustard, right? So if you're growing horseradish, you want plenty of those glucosinolates. You want that spicy hot mustard. But if you're growing greens, I don't know if you want up accumulation of that. Actually, that's kind of part of why winter grown brassicas are so delicious, is that they respond to cool temperatures by making more sugars. It acts as a cryoprotectant in the leaf. And they also make the friendlier version of the glucosinolates because they just have evolved to know that there's not a lot of insects coming to take a bite out of them. So they're going to have the friendlier version of those spicy mustards. They're going to literally be sweeter, and they're going to taste sweeter too because they're less bitter and they're less spicy.
oh, well, that's interesting. I think a lot of people know that greens are sweeter in the winter, but I never knew why. So thank you. Actually, that's a really good segue because the next question was about brassicas. And the person says, hi there. When growing organically, how do you recommend protecting cruciferous beds from aphids and cabbage moths? And they say they have tried insect row cover, that it often blows open or keeps them from seeing the early infestations when they get them. In other areas, they plant calendula and dill and have considered using BTs. What do you suggest? Thank you. So they're asking about aphids and cabbage moths. Oh, and Anna, I will mention that you just recently wrote a great article for Growing for Market about, if I had to summarize like thresholds of like how to know when your pest infestations on brassicas specifically, that's why I thought of this, are when they're okay and when it's time to freak out. And so I will make that article public in the show notes. So you can, sounds like it could be a good resource for that person. B, you can refer to it if you'd like, if you want.
Sure.
So we can put that down there. So they're asking about aphids and cabbage moths on crucifers.
Yeah, they're asking about a couple different things. And so the thing that's very funny about brassicas is that from an entomologist point of view, I tend to lump them all together because they all have this glucosinolate, this secondary plant metabolite that plant has evolved to protect itself against herbivory. It's essentially a compound that's safe in the plant unless it's combined with another enzyme, myrosinase. So next time you're in the garden and you have a raw piece of mustard or kale or whatever and you chew it up, you might notice there's like a little bit of a lag before you taste that spicy glucosinolate, right? Especially like a mustard green. It's because that myrosinase and the glucosinolate are combining with water and making something that's spicier, right? So the next time you chew into a raw brassica leaf, keep that in mind. There's a chemical reaction happening. So the insect that takes a bite out of it, somebody who doesn't have a defense mechanism against it is going to go like bleh and run away and not eat it. So you will see a whole complex of insects on those plants that are very different from the complex of insects that you'll see on other plants because they've developed a tolerance to brassicas. And most of them, not only have they developed a tolerance to those glucosinolates, many of them sequester that chemical for their own chemical defense, right? So they have all sorts of ways to protect themselves from predators and parasitoids, things like that.
Oh, wow. Using it to their advantage. Okay.
Using them to their advantage. So that is one of the reasons they're so diabolical. That being said, for the caterpillars, most of them are rather easily controlled with that BT product. And what makes that BT product so IPM friendly. So when we're talking about an integrated pest management, we are thinking about taking an integrated approach to controlling a pest that reduces disruptions in those natural enemies. So BT, the strain that is labeled for caterpillars, is only toxic to lepidopteran caterpillars that eat that material. So it's not toxic to the parasitoids. It's not toxic to the predators. So this is why it's such a powerful tool, is it does a really, really nice job at controlling, especially smaller larvae that take a bite out of it without reducing anything else. And even in like larger commercial settings where they do rely on really broad spectrum insecticides, they are much more likely to rely on BT because of this phenomena, that things will get out of control if they use a broad spectrum neurotoxin versus this oral toxicant. It's a systemic poison. So if you're on the fence about whether or not to use pesticides, this is one where it will really do a good job of solving your problem without causing new problems. Put it that way.
Right. Oh, okay, because it's only going to be killing the bad guys because they have to be there eating whatever you sprayed. It's not going to kill the bees it's flying by, crawling around. Like they have to actually consume it because it's toxic in the gut or something like that?
It's both. Not only do they have to consume it, but it's only toxic to that group. So
okay, so super specific. Okay.
It's super specific, right?
Okay.
So like a bee could eat this, no problem, and not be affected. Oh. Yeah. So it's both of these things. There's a couple other products that is more like what you were saying. As long as they're not being exposed to it, then it's not a problem. So like anything that contains spinosad, so Entrust, anything that has spinosad in it, that does have more broad range efficacy, but you're less likely to be exposed to it if you're not eating that plant. But with BT, it's both of those things.
Okay.
Oh, and we wanted to talk about dill and Phacelia.
Yeah, they said they say they plant calendula and dill, but yeah, what are your thoughts about that?
So I did want to highlight the fact that the University of New Hampshire did some research recently, specifically looking at cabbage aphid. And so they said aphids in their question, and I'm going to take a guess and say they're talking about cabbage aphid. And cabbage aphid is a very standout species. It is very different than the other aphid species that you might find on other plants. So something like a green peach aphid has a very broad host range. You'll find that on lots of different plant families. Cabbage aphid, it's a dead giveaway because it has kind of a gray cast to it. I know up here in New Hampshire, people call it gray aphid sometimes. That's actually a wax that the insect extrudes, and they cover their body with this wax. That's what gives it the gray look. Another thing that is a big standout about this particular aphid species is it really likes to feed in like the growing points, the meristematic tissue. So you know how, and like, you know how I was saying, like, I kind of lump all the brassica plants together, but really when you're thinking about what they're grown for, they're really quite different. So for kale, if you're just growing it for a leaf, cabbage aphid, it's probably not that big of a deal. You can wash it off the leaf. But if you're growing Brussels sprouts, they are right inside that growing point. So like the thing that you are selling is the thing that they are the most attracted to. And you're more likely to have them show up when you're not paying attention, and that head will close up. This is the case with cabbage too. That head will close up. You might not notice it, and they're in there. And that's a real shock horror when it gets to the consumer. So this is another reason this insect is so diabolical. Also, that gray waxy stuff over the cast of it makes it a little bit harder for parasitoids to handle. And there is some evidence that it's sequestering those spicy glucosinolate mustard gas compounds for its own chemical defense. So what we know about aphids in general is that dill and Phacelia and sweet alyssum, they are excellent at attracting the predators that eat aphids, right? So most of these groups, we're talking about like predatory flies, lady beetles. The adults will eat the nectar and pollen in the flowers, and then they will lay eggs near the aphids, and the offspring are actually the ones that eat the aphids. Those plants do a great job of supporting those populations on your farm. What we don't know that much about is what species actually eat the gray aphid. So the research that was done at the University of New Hampshire was looking into whether or not we can improve the populations of these biocontrol agents on the farm. And they were very successful. They had tons of hoverflies, tons of lady beetles, tons of parasitoid wasps, but they still had tons of gray aphid. They still had tons of cabbage aphid. And I suspect what happened is they just didn't have the species on the farm that eat the gray aphid.
Yeah.
So they were supporting lots of beneficial insects, but they just didn't happen to have the right beneficial insects. A couple things that have been considered in the scientific world is whether or not you can put some species on the farm and maybe those beneficial insectary plants will harbor them and make them better. Another thing, and this is just theoretical, is whether or not having brassica insectary plants is helpful. Like if you are going after a brassica specialist, would it help to have a brassica insectary plant? Would it be more likely to attract those beneficials? These are still all very theoretical. But right now, even though it's really clear that planting these flowering plants does a great job at supporting natural enemies on the farm, if you don't have the right natural enemy species, then it can only do so much for you.
Yeah. Okay. It sounds like the cabbage aphids are making themselves as unattractive to eat as possible.
Right?
So are we looking for that? Is that the state of the research? Is it we're looking for what predator likes to eat cabbage aphids?
Yeah, I'm trying to make the case. So right now, if you're looking at the state of affairs in brassica pest management research, so much of our attention is targeted towards diamondback moth. And that's a global pest, and it has horrible chemical resistance problems. So if you're talking about an example of where research dollars are going completely missing the mark of a market farmer, this is a really good example. There's not a lot of research dollars going towards cabbage aphids specifically because it's really well controlled using systemic insecticides. So a grower could use a neonicotinoid to control this, no problemo. If you are not using a systemic insecticide, you're kind of up a creek without a paddle. I think the way that most people approach it is that they take a very aggressive approach using insecticidal soaps. And really, as soon as you see a cabbage aphid in a crop that is very susceptible, like something that you're very worried about, that growing point, use a soap. A product containing azadirachtin can be a little pricey, but that is the active ingredient of raw neem oil. So if you buy a neem oil off the shelf, take a very close look at the label because most neem oil products say clarified neem oil. And that means that the active ingredient azadirachtin has actually been taken out of that product.
Oh.
Right.
Not really going to work.
Well, the way that neem oils work is twofold, right? So neem oils work in the same way that a horticultural oil works. So it will smother the insect body, so a soft-bodied insect like an aphid. It will smother that. It'll interact with its integument in a way that kind of opens it up and it'll bleed out. I'm getting a little graphic here. But that's the way an oil or a soap works. So a soybean oil, of potassium, salts, fatty acid, things like that, they all kind of work the same way. So a neem oil that says clarified acts the same way as any other horticultural oil. So some people prefer to go with the neem because it's a botanical product versus a petroleum-based product. But if it says clarified, that means the azadirachtin has been taken out.
Well, that's good to know. I didn't know to look for that.
I think it's probably a byproduct of the process because most of the products that you buy that have azadirachtin in it have a known quantity of azadirachtin in it. So they're extracting the azadirachtin from that neem oil in order to put it into a product. And the leftover it's good. It's still doing something. It just doesn't have that insect growth regulator that azadirachtin works as. So any product that has aza in it, it has azadirachtin in it. It's also not toxic. it's not going to have non-target impacts because it's a growth regulator. What it's going to do is stop that aphid from reproducing as fast as she would. She's going to halt her reproduction entirely. Any of her daughters that she's pooped out recently are not going to proceed in their development, right? So you can see where like that really stops the growth of any kind of insect population in its tracks. So these products are a little expensive. That's the only reason I would say don't run right out as soon as you see an aphid and spray this. It would be more like as soon as you see an aphid, start with those insecticidal soaps. Once it gets above a threshold, that's when you would, lay down the cash for that insect growth regulator.
Yeah. Okay, that's helpful. And if I remember correctly, you had posted on Instagram not that long ago a picture of some just like horribly infested Brussels sprouts.
Yeah.
If people haven't seen this, they can go check out the feed and see a infested.
That was a photo from Alan Eaton. So he was the entomologist that preceded me at the University of New Hampshire. It looks like an AI picture, but it's real because Alan took it well before AI. But that's how bad it can get. And again, like I think anybody who had that bad of an infestation, they don't mind splashing the cash on that azadirachtin. But the other thing that's also very diabolical about aphids is they're super hard to predict. There's tons of insect pests that we're really good at predicting their life cycles. We can kind of say we expect them to show up based on this temperature, or we'll have lures that we can put a trap out and monitor like their movement in the field. Aphids are much trickier. Sometimes what will happen is that we'll have a condition where like it's really, really dry and all the wild hosts that they're living on in and around our farm all die. And so they go, oh crap, and they fly and they find your farm, right? Sometimes you have like a nice lush wonderful environment for them and they're fine on their wild hosts outside of the farm and they never disperse and they never come to your farm. So what always happens whenever we have a graduate student that is assigned to a project, and that happened with the UNH research, they had a master's student who was super excited about studying cabbage aphid and they made all these plans to do all these field experiments and they set them all up and the cabbage aphids didn't show up. Because it was just the year that they didn't show up, right? So there was one year where they got a really, really nice trial. They tested this product against that product and they had some nice results. And they're like, all right, we're ready for our year 2 to confirm what we found. And aphids didn't show up. So that is another huge problem is like, how do you make a plan for controlling this really diabolical pest? You just kind of have to be out there watching for them, unfortunately, for that one.
Yeah. Do some scouting. Okay. All right. Well, that's good. And one of the things that I liked about your article is I don't think we used the freak out title in the magazine. I think we made it something else. But I think when you sent it to us originally, it was like looking at pest populations in brassicas, how to know when to freak out, how to know when not to act and when to freak out. I forget because we changed it, but that makes so much sense after the work that I did with Dr. Morse, because so there's a take home here for the audience, I think, which is that because that place very well. I worked for a year at Virginia Tech doing some studies with Professor Ron Morse about farmscaping. And so some of the research that he and other people were doing showed that brassicas can actually take a fair amount of damage when they're young, and people should go look it up. I want to say like brassicas could lose up to 50% of their leaf area before buttoning or heading, and still achieve normal yields or yields not be impacted. And my point in mentioning that is just that there is like a freak out point. That's important to know is when you're past the threshold to do something, because actually like the freak out point, honestly, for me with brassicas was higher than I anticipated. Like that's because if you're looking at small brassica plants that have been 50% defoliated, like they're looking pretty rough, right? So like, I think that would be hard to watch your brassica seedlings get defoliated up to 50% before doing anything. But I think the take home is that they can take some damage without affecting your final harvest. So like you said, if it's a leaf crop, the leaves need to be pretty perfect. You can't have aphids all over the leaves. People won't like that. But if you're selling a heading brassica crop like broccoli or cabbage or something like that, you can wait a little bit and see, especially if you've done, farmscaping or release beneficials and things like that. Like if you think you have a good beneficial population, am I right that, like the pest population might spike and then all of a sudden the beneficials are feeding off the pest, then that population, like the population of the beneficial should follow the population of the pest, right? As long as you have the right ones around.
100%. Yeah. And that's, I would totally agree with that, especially when it comes to these caterpillars. So even though there's about a dozen different species of caterpillars that anybody could find on their brassicas, and that would depend.
There are a lot of caterpillars on brassicas.
There's a lot of them. There's a lot. So they'll have really different life cycles and they'll show up at different times of the year, depending on the species. Some are migratory, some are local. But for the most part, they do show these different patterns, and like either they'll go away because, their natural enemies have showed up. But I feel the same exact way. And I think most people who have a lot of experience growing broccoli specifically, they're used to this. Like either the caterpillar does something else or, natural enemies show up and do their job. In a couple other circumstances, I'd think about like maybe flea beetles. That might be something that, your plant can tolerate a lot, but after 3, 5, 6 years of growing like a never-ending buffet of brassicas, sometimes you do develop a population of flea beetles that's going to cause you problems. So depending on where you're at in your tolerance and when you freak out, that might be something that, every once in a while you kind of want to assess, well, maybe we should do something to knock back this flea beetle population. Maybe we should take a break from growing brassicas, especially during the summertime. That might be something. Some people might take a more aggressive approach to using pesticides just for a season. And trust is something that people could use for that. The pyganics is something that people could use, just knowing I'm just going to beat this back a little bit so it's more easy to maintain this year. But again, every scenario is different.
Yeah. Okay. That's why people need to be scouting and talking to their extension agent. All right. We got a question from someone saying that there's something putting small holes in basil, shiso, and cucumber leaves. But they mentioned that the growing tip seems okay. They see a few tiny orange bugs, but they're not convinced that is what is doing the damage. And they also say that the damage is in a wet area of a hoop house, and that the higher, drier, warmer parts of the same hoop house are unaffected.
I think they really should share this photo with somebody because I looked it up. So shiso is related to mint. Is my understanding of that, yes?
Yeah, it sounds right.
So it sounds like this is something that's eating the mint family.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, whenever I hear tiny holes, I think flea beetle. And that's just to remember that every plant family has its own complex of flea beetles, right? So usually when we say flea beetles, we're talking about crucifer flea beetles. And when we're saying crucifer flea beetles, we're usually talking about 2 or 3 different species of beetles. But there are different species that are evolved to eat like solanaceous plants. So there's a whole complex of flea beetles that eat solanaceous crops. And there will be a whole complex of flea beetles that eat lamiates, these mint families. So I'm not really sure. I did take a look. I'm not sure if there's anything stand out. They should certainly submit a photo to their local extension or send it along, and I can share it with the Brain Trust because I've never seen anything like this personally.
Okay. Yeah, it definitely didn't ring any bells for me. I think they're in the Pacific Northwest. I don't know if that's all helpful. I think I know who this person is. So I didn't put the Instagram handles on here, partially because I didn't ask. People probably wouldn't mind, but I seem to remember, I think this is from somebody I knew who it is, who is up in the Pacific Northwest. So
yeah, if they want to share a photo, I can share it with an entomologist in the Pacific Northwest too. I'm sure I can find somebody.
Okay. All right. I'll ask him to send us a picture. Because, yeah, that's the mystery, the tale of the mystery bug. All right. We'll see what we can do. Okay. So we got 2 questions about thrips. And I know there's different species of thrips, but so I'll just read both of the thrip questions in case there's any relatedness. So there's one person who's asking about thrips in both netted and unnetted high tunnel growing tomatoes and lettuce. And they say that they get worse every year, even with a substantial beneficial insect population, sticky tags, etc. And then someone else wanted to know whether regular misting of water would knock out the thrips population. So we can just say What are your thoughts on thrips? What are your thoughts on these questions?
Oh man, they are really, really tough. I have a couple general comments about thrips. Is that I worked at this high tunnel project recently, and it was a collaboration at the University of New Hampshire, Purdue, and the University of Illinois. So I'm basing this based on tomato tunnel growers in those regions. Is that we almost never see a thrips problem in high tunnel tomato unless you have a thrips problem in high tunnel tomato and it's really, really bad, right? So like maybe 10% of the tomato growers that I worked with, like most of them are like, no, absolutely not. I've never had a problem with thrips. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. And some of them have horrible, cannot solve the problem thrips. So this is a conversation that's going on in my networks right now. There is currently another project specifically asking this. Some researchers at Penn State and Cornell are looking at thrips populations in tomato and really looking at this question of like, why is it that like sometimes it's nothing and I would say it's probably beneficial. It's a matter of like biocontrols being knocked out. But the folks who have the biggest problem with thrips, they have a couple things in common. They are usually growing some kind of flowering crop in their high tunnels, right? So especially people who, they don't have as much tunnel space. It's a high value real estate. They'll be growing things year round below, and then maybe they'll have hanging baskets in the space above. More often than not, anybody who has the thrips problems in their tomatoes, they're also growing bedding plants. They're also bringing in plants from other areas, and those thrips are bringing in chemical resistance. So even if you're using pesticides, there's going to be some issues with that. There's also some issues with that constant flow of plants coming into the greenhouse. So because it's such high value real estate, it is very, very difficult to imagine a time where that's left fallow. So people who are going from lettuce to tomato or spinach to tomato, and there's never a resting period, that also seems to be part of the syndrome of the tunnels that have tomato problems. Another thing about tunnels that people kind of forget is because they're unheated, you think, there's nothing going on in there. Even if you left your tunnel fallow, I'm thinking of one site, they have a horrible thrips problem and they do a really, really good job of cleaning out their tunnels. Like they're starting with no weeds in the wintertime. And we put some sticky cards out just to see what we could trap in that tunnel. And we were catching adult thrips in February, right? So basically,
would not have guessed that.
I would not have guessed it either. I was really, really shocked. So thrips they'll enter like a reproductive quiescence. There's nothing that's shutting them down. So aphids, they'll continue to reproduce if they have enough temperatures. Thrips, they'll pause, so it'll look like they've gone away, but they're like kind of laying low in the soil. And once they have enough temperatures, they'll start making eggs. They'll start laying them on plants. So they'll get going quite early. And I think that might be part of it, is that they are allowed to get a jump start on the season and reproduce a little bit earlier in the season than we think. And it just takes nature a really long time to take over once the sidewalls come up in the springtime. For aphids, predatory flies show up, like the cavalry shows up as soon as the sidewalls open, and aphids kind of go away. But I don't know if that's the case for thrips, and that might explain it. Long story short, it's kind of a mystery, and those are my best guesses.
Okay.
But as far as what they should do, I mean, this is pure speculation on my part. I really think a high summer solarization might be the answer. So if there is a possibility of cycling certain tunnels out of production during the highest heat of summertime, that would be the time to think about sanitation. And you're not going to be able to have the same success during winter, unfortunately.
Oh, you mean not going to have the same success clearing out the greenhouse of pests in the wintertime because you need to take all the plants out so there's nothing to feed on, make it really hot in there, that kind of thing?
I think that you'll have more success with solarization as a sanitation practice than freezing out pests.
Yeah, I think you're right. So yes, that's may depending on their cropping schedule, they just have to free up the greenhouse in what might be the prime time of year for using it. So,
and it's not great advice because it's not tried and true, but there's definitely lots of evidence for solarization and like the certain time periods that you would have to have those temperatures reach certain things. Another thing, and this may or may not be the case, but an issue that we also have noticed with tomato growers specifically that have a problem with thrips damage, so like the cosmetic damage caused by thrips on tomato, is every once in a while growers will mistake damage that is stress for thrips damage. So for example, we're talking about like that gold speckling that you might see on fruit that's cosmetic injury. Oftentimes that's due to high humidity or extreme changes in temperature and humidity. And especially if you're thinking about people who are really pushing into the shoulder season. So people who are heating, like maybe they're planting in February and they're harvesting tomatoes before the sidewalls come up, you're more likely to see cosmetic injury due to abiotic conditions. So if somebody in their mind says gold flecking, that's thrips, they might have a perceived idea that they have a worse thrips problem than they do.
Uh-huh.
And that has been shown time and time again through spray trials where people are spraying the daylights out of their tomatoes. Their thrips numbers are like down here and they're still seeing the same quote unquote thrips damage. And that's because it's quite difficult to distinguish the difference between that abiotic cosmetic damage and thrips damage. For me, my rule of thumb is that you can kind of feel the thrips damage, like because they're using rasping, feeding mouth parts and running against the cells of it. You can feel like a little tiny callus. It's kind of hard to tell, but if it's just abiotic, you're not going to feel any kind of callus in the surface of the tomato.
Okay.
Does that ring any bells for you? Because you've been working with tomatoes inside.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. And I just want to, so define, in case people aren't familiar with abiotic, by that you mean it basically, like if it's a abiotic problem, it means it's with the environment. It's not caused by a living, I'm familiar with that term, but the abiotic means it's not caused by a living thrip. It's caused by your environmental conditions, not a critter.
Right. Yeah. So we usually say like a disease is caused by a pathogen, right? And insect damage is caused by an insect. So something that's not caused by a living organism is abiotic. I mean, stress, high humidity, high heat, extreme shifts in temperature and humidity.
Yes. Okay. So not a living culprit.
Right.
As in the case with pathogens or pest insects and bugs. Yeah. Okay. That's a good term. And I just wanted to, in case people hadn't encountered it, just want to make sure I get a definition on it. Okay. So there is somebody who wrote in who is having mystery wilting, and they say they have 2 beds that are wilting, a cauliflower bed and a mustard bed. So, okay, they're both brassicas. The area where the stem enters the soil, there's an enormous amount of ant activity, and the soil around the stem is essentially pushed back. Are the ants causing this? What is the best way to prevent this? I just dusted with DT. I assume they mean diatomaceous earth? DT.
I'm not sure. We could talk about that too. There's a lot of elements of this question that were interesting to me. I'm going to divide it up into 3 different ways to think about this. So if you have a plant that's wilting, obviously they've already done the first step, which is like to check out the root system to see what's interacting with that. Because obviously they're not doing anything different in terms of watering, right? It sounds like it's just like an individual, like a few plants are having a problem and everybody else looks great. That's my assumption. A lot of the times distinguishing between insect damage and some kind of disease is our next step. And so if we're thinking about diseases that might be a soil-borne disease, we're looking for like softening or rotting or soft tissues. So like there's so many soil-borne pathogens that are kind of ubiquitous, but sometimes the environment gets just right, or you have a susceptible plant and you'll have patches of this. And as long as you have nice firm tissue, it's not rotting away, I'd rule out diseases. It sounds like they've already done that because they've said it's just being hollowed out. It looks like it might be ants, right? So for a really long time, and this is a huge mea culpa on my part as an entomologist, and I'm going to be so bold as to speak to other entomologists in my field, for a really long time we said, no, ants don't do that. It's something else. And like you're seeing the ants and you're blaming the ants. They were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. I actually don't think that this is true. I think ants do every once in a while do that. And because us generalist entomologists who work with lots of different groups of insects, for whatever reason, we kind of stay away from ants. And I think that even people who study ants, like they're kind of their own creatures because ants are so fascinating. They're just like the most amazing things. They're quite difficult to identify because they have so many different life forms in their caste system. And like sometimes, if you find a male or you find a worker ant or you find this, like you'll have different rubrics of how to identify what species of ant you're talking about. So that's something that, to be honest, like I just never bothered to learn because I was like, ants don't eat plants. They don't bite our plants.
Yeah.
What are you talking about? But come to find out, there's a couple different groups of ants that will attack vegetable crops in a couple different circumstances. And it sounds like a lot of the times it's in high tunnels. We'll see that. It's in high tunnels. It's almost always in high organic matter soils. So if you're thinking about, like your market garden, it's like organic soil, like you're extending your season. Oh, oftentimes it's in wooded areas. Oh, there's a lot of bells being rung. So what will happen in some of these groups is that in nature, they build what they call solariums, right? So they'll clear a little space of vegetation and they'll build it in such a structure that it stays kind of warm and they'll do some anti things below it. And so what we have done is created a solarium in the middle of the woods in our high tunnels. And they're like, oh, this is great. Thanks so much. And so like they do their little anti things in there. And then all of a sudden come springtime, you put a transplant in it and they go, I think not. And they inject their little formic acid into that plant and you'll see that like it'll kind of like shrivel up near the plant surface and it looks kind of like wire stem. Like there's a couple of diseases that it looks like. So you can see why, an entomologist like me would be like, ants don't eat plants. That's a disease. That's something else. And so that's something that we are seeing more and more often in high tunnels and wooded areas. What they're talking about sounds like it's chewing away. There might be something going on there. I'm not really sure. For a long time, we were hearing people saying, oh, well, maybe they're just like, they're building their structures in the root system and it's not necessarily that they're eating the roots, but maybe just like their anti-behaviors are disturbing the roots. We're not really sure. All I can say is there's something going on here. So as long as you've ruled out any of the other problems, it sounds like most people are just having to replace those transplants and they are controlling those ants as though that they were in a structure. So this is where we have always gotten into like a little bit of weird, regulatory trouble, because a lot of the times people will say like, what can I do to control these ants? There's actually two problems here, which is like most products that we use for ants are registered for use inside our homes, inside structures, right? There's not a lot of products that are registered for use in vegetable crops. There's a spinosad bait that is registered for use in vegetable crops that you can put out, and it does have efficacy on bait. So that's that gut poison. When it comes to household ant baits, technically it's a structure. I mean, if you're putting it out in an ant bait, as long as it's not touching the crop, we think you're probably doing fine there. And most of those ant baits are sugar mixed with some kind of boric acid. So again, that's a gut poison. And if it's an ant species that doesn't really like sugar, it might not work, right? So some ant species are more cued in on lipids and fats. I talked to an ant specialist who I was like, what do you do to like have a bait that's broadly attractive to all your ant species? And she goes, we use pecan sandies, the cookies, the pecan sandies, because they have a lot of sugar, they have a lot of fat, they have some protein from the pecans. It's the perfect ant bait for their research where they're trying to put a bait out to catch everybody. But every once in a while, you'll have an ant species that won't respond to that sugar, so the bait is not great. But those household baits, they are in a container, and that's a big part of being able to retrieve that container as far as regulation goes. However, they're not organically certified. So for people who are certified organic, this is a conversation you're going to have with your certifier to see, what passes muster according to their reading of that.
Right. Okay. So I guess you could try to really make sure it's the ants doing it in the first place. Because that actually, when I read this question, I was wondering, like, I wasn't sure if ants could even be the culprit. So it sounds like you think that in certain cases they are. Okay, so they could be on the right track. I do. All right. Well, yeah. I mean, as with anything, folks, if you're certified organic, of course, always talk about it with your certifier, because I think we've made our own ant baits in the house. Yeah, with what you described, like sugar and borax or something like that. So I do wonder if a certifier would approve like sugar borax water, since borax is a
It's not as effective as boric acid, right? So if you were making your own homemade ant baits, which you're not supposed to according to law, you would have to seek out boric acid. I think you would have to have a pretty high concentration of borax to get a dose. But, if you're dealing with an animal that likes that sugar, I think you'll be fine.
Yeah. Who knows? Maybe we were just feeding our ants. Maybe that's why we had such a bad ant problem. Okay, that's good. I learned something, just that ants can actually be the problem. So
sometimes rule out the other stuff first.
Yeah. Okay, so observe. So it sounds like they should observe their crop and try to get a handle on whether it really is the ants in the first place, and then talk to their certifier if they're certified organic. Okay, the next person said we are in year 2 of garden flea hopper, so this is an interesting one. I had not heard of garden flea hopper. They helpfully provided the botanical name Microtechnites bractatus, I want to say. Probably mispronounced that, but that's the general ballpark. So they are having garden flea hoppers on their greenhouse cucumbers, and it's really bad. And they say their IPM person had nothing for them. Please help. Do you know anything about garden flea hoppers?
I know that they're a murid. They're very closely related to tarnished plant bug. So we could probably talk about tarnished plant bug as well.
Oh, yeah. Actually, I wasn't sure if we'd have time, but people kept submitting questions. Somebody asked about tarnished plant bugs, which I'm not surprised, because it seems like they mess up everything. Yes, so, all right. Let's talk about, what do you got to say about garden flea hoppers and tarnished plant bugs?
So this species, I see it everywhere. It's very ubiquitous. So like I mentioned before that we will monitor for pest populations using sticky cards. It's pretty common. It's a very common species to see in most of the regions I've worked. I've never seen it get to a level where it's causing damage. So I wasn't surprised to hear they've seen it. I'm really surprised to hear that they have an economically threatening population of it. So that's very interesting to me. It's a very understudied species. I couldn't find anything that had anything to do with management in the literature. So most of, if you do a search of this and, in the Scholar, whatever, and it comes up just taxonomical things, you go, okay, there's not any pest management research to do with this. Okay. So, I will generally say that the Murid family, Muridae, this is the tarnished plant bugs, the plant hoppers that they're talking about, they're really quite interesting in how they find their hosts, because we usually think about insects cueing into smells in order to find their host plants. Either, they're flying around, they're following odor cues either from their plants or from their relatives, or some sexy male who's found a tasty plant to eat. They're following these odor plumes to find them, or they're cueing in on some kind of site. These insects are more likely to just kind of hop around. Maybe they'll respond to the color of a fast growing plant, and they'll land on it and they'll take a test bite, and they'll decide whether or not to feed based on that test bite. And that is why we find them more often on the seed heads of weeds. So I don't know, this time of year, you might be weeding your pigweeds or whatever, and oops, the seed head maybe got away from you. And you're more likely to see tarnished plant bug on those weeds. So if you look in the guides about how to deal with your tarnished plant bug, your murids, they go, eliminate your weeds, and then you won't harbor these insects. And that might be true in the long run, but that also means that if you eliminate those weeds at the wrong time, you're flushing them into your crop. So that, be forewarned. And that's kind of part of the story for tarnished plant bug specifically, because this is Lygus bug. There's a couple different species of Lygus. There's Lygus lineaire. This is a major pest of strawberry in California and Florida. It's a major pest of cut flower. It's a major pest of apple. It's a major pest of alfalfa. It's a major pest of everything, because it goes after the seeds of things. And it's based on that behavior. It lands on it, eats it, goes, okay, I'm going to stay here for a little while. soil. So in the Northeast, the story goes that this species was well controlled by its natural enemies until we started growing a lot of alfalfa. This is the second time I'm going to cite Alan Eaton, New Hampshire's entomologist for a very long time. I asked him about there's a biocontrol that was released for tarnished plant bug in the 80s and 90s. And the way he started the story was, well, you know how alfalfa is kind of a new crop for us? And I was like, oh my goodness, like, yeah, I guess so. In the grand scheme of things, it is kind of a new crop. So like in the 70s and 80s, we were growing a lot of alfalfa. And come to find out that—
I didn't know that.
I know, but like take a step back in time with me. And so at the time, we were growing a lot of alfalfa. And what was happening is they were mowing these alfalfa fields and flushing huge numbers of tarnished plant bugs into orchards, into strawberry patches, into all these different places. And come to find out, our parasitoids that were doing a pretty good job of controlling tarnished plant bug weren't good at finding them in alfalfa, because it was a new crop for them in an evolutionary time frame. So back in the day where the USDA used to just like nimbly bimbly release biological controls, they went to Europe and brought back a new species of parasitoid and released it. There was a program where the state of New Jersey and New York and New Hampshire released this biocontrol for tarnished plant bug, and it turned the volume down a little bit. I think it, brought it back down to like 1950s, 1960s levels. So a lot of the time, especially in the Northeast, you'll read like, oh, we released this biocontrol. We don't have to worry about tarnished plant bug anymore. That's not the case. What I see in the literature for how people deal with this on a commercial scale, you will see growers in California using literal vacuums, right? So like they'll have these big structures, they'll go over like beds and suck up everything from blooming strawberry. So in general, we don't recommend this because like this is actually such a good approach that you suck up all the beneficials too. Right?
Well, yeah.
So in a system where Lygus is their key pest, like it causes the most problems because it's feeding it with its piercing, sucking mouth parts in a growing fruit, and it's causing cat facing. So in strawberry, they have decided it's worth that disruptive approach to just suck everybody off the plants. And they're out there every couple of weeks, sucking everything off the plants with these huge vacuums, right? So that's the approach they've taken. I wouldn't recommend that for everybody because you're bound to flare aphids, other issues. So that's a strawberry specific problem. I think my next question for this particular grower is, where are you seeing your biggest issues? Is it cut flower? Is it your fruiting vegetable crops? Is it your perennial fruit crops? That would have to come first. Where do you see your biggest problems with tarnished plant bug on your farm?
Yeah, on feeding, I want to say on the feeding on the growing point of, I feel like a pretty wide variety of crops, and then also sometimes feeding on the petals of flowers. So of course that, they make it's one of those things that it's not great if you're trying to sell them looking perfect.
Well, unfortunately, I think if you have a really high value crop that you can't deal with any amount of tarnished plant bug damage, that would be where you would look at keeping that exclusion netting in place and keeping animals off of it. If you have a fruiting crop like strawberry, I know that there's lots of thresholds that actually use the nymphs as an indicator of concern. So the adults come in, they lay eggs, they hatch into nymphs, and the sign of how many nymphs is usually used to say how big of a problem you have in your planting. So there are some numbers out there that have like thresholds. And for the nymphs, you can use insecticidal soaps to control those nymphs, those soft-bodied, but the adults are much, much harder to control. So I think it depends on how bad your problem is. Do be aware that they're more likely to come into those weedy areas first. And that might be a place where, they are, and you can target anything that's close to where they are. I'm not sure if that's very satisfying. Do you have any other specific questions about, how people have handled tarnished plant bug and other crops?
Well, if that's the answer, it's the answer. I mean, there's some strategies there. It's like you said, I'm hearing you could use the soap to try to go after the nymphs. And then I guess it all depends on scale, because they specifically said greenhouse cucumber. So
if
it's a small planting, they could go in and, I don't know, try to but like, I don't know if you could dust buster them.
Yeah.
Or if that would be, I mean, that's an idea.
Man, that's what I would do. If it was in an enclosed area, I would get out a shop vac, anything that you wouldn't mind getting a bunch of dirt into.
Yeah.
You know, again, like I used to use, paint strainer bags on the end of a leaf blower that's set to suck. Those are things that I wouldn't recommend in every circumstance because you're more likely to cause damage to your crop. Again, maybe those weeds could be a trap crop where you're using a really aggressive approach to vacuuming your pigweeds, right? And that's how you get your tarnished plant bug.
Yeah, maybe. Well, I mean, without knowing more, we would just be speculating. But so sounds like it doesn't say whether their greenhouse is screened, but maybe they could put insect netting on that. Like that would slow the population in, and then try to deal with the population in there.
I will recommend Purdue put out a growing guide for greenhouse cucumbers specifically, and they did look at this question of whether or not to exclude pests. They were looking at something very small. They were looking at thrips at the time. So you also have to worry about airflow if you're thinking about excluding insects from the whole tunnel. And if depending on what kind of cucumber you're growing, they may be more sensitive to flower abortion from high heat, and you're causing more problems than you're solving there. But what I will say with this mirid that we don't know that much about, I would guess it is also going after similar things. So it'll show that same preference for a seeding weed as well. I would love to hear more from these folks about where they see these mirids, and maybe some sleuthing out as to how this population got so out of control. Like if it was maybe something they saw and then maybe they overwintered, and like maybe it was year after year after year that this population built up. I kind of want to hear more about it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, if you're listening, you'll know how to get a hold of Anna, and you know how to get a hold of us. Reach out if you're listening and want to talk more about the garden flea hoppers. Yeah, because that does sound,
very unusual.
Yeah. Okay. Someone had a question about controlling cyclamen mites on peppers. Is that, anything about that?
This is actually a hot topic. This is really interesting.
I'm not real familiar with cyclamen mites. Okay.
Yeah, this is a situation of growing concern in two different scenarios. So broad mite and pepper, we were hearing a lot of stories a couple of years ago about people bringing in transplants that had broad mite on them, and they didn't know that they had broad mite until it was too late. So by the time you see the actual impact of the broad mite damage, you're seeing fruit that is like rust colored, like this weird leathery top to it. It's really, really distinctive. You can't miss it. But by the time you see it, it's way, way too late to do anything about it. So most of the folks that I spoke to that had this problem where they brought in transplants from, I'm not really sure exactly where they came from. They said, okay, well, what do we do next year? Like, do they overwinter in the have I introduced a problem to my tunnels that I'm going to have to deal with from now on? And I said, I'm not really sure. We know that these mites do not overwinter very well in open culture, but it is possible that they could overwinter in a high tunnel environment. And I never heard from them again. So I think that's good news. They didn't have a problem. So
no news is good news.
That is good news that they didn't have a problem. And it kind of points to the fact that, maybe this introduction was not the death knell on that tunnel. It's not like they had to take extreme measures afterwards. I'd like to hear more from anybody who's seeing broad mite if they continue to see it from, year after year, because the solution to the problem requires a preventative approach, right? So if you do discover you have a local population of broad mite that you've introduced into your tunnel, there's tons of biocontrol options. All of the predatory mites that are effective on the other group of mite species will have efficacy on that. So if you have a situation where year after year you're seeing the same thing and you have a resident population, there are biocontrol options for you. But I have never heard of anybody having a chronic problem with broad mite.
Oh, and okay, so cyclamen is the same as broad mite?
Kind of. This is the other hot topic, right? So when we think of spider mites, we're talking about two-spotted spider mite and red mite and things like that. They're in one group of mites. The cyclamen mites and the broad mite are in a different family. They're the tarsinamid mites, right? So you'd think like, oh, how much do I need to know about mites? They're not related to the two-spotted mites. But good news is that there are some options for biocontrol. So we kind of group these things together because they are really, really hard to see. They're a little bit smaller. They're more likely to be in growing points. Another issue we're seeing is in strawberry production. So this is an issue with people who are sending around cuttings of strawberries, having cyclamen mites coming along. This is a big enough problem that's really impacting the industry in Canada. So they are looking at better ways to detect these really cryptic arthropods in plant tissue and using DNA barcoding and things like that to have some kind of screening process, because they're becoming a big enough issue in that industry that they want to have certified clean strawberry shoots the same way you would have like certified virus clean, right? So that's how small and cryptic these arthropods are, is it's very hard to detect them. And so looking for ways to handle that similarly as we handle viruses.
Okay. And which one is the russet mite then?
The russet mite is a slightly different group, right? So that's a rust mite. So I have been hearing more people having problems with rust mites in tomatoes in the past couple of years. And that sounds like another emerging pest. And unfortunately, that is a third group of mites. So I'm not too sure about that. I've been asking some people questions. I was like, what's going on? Like, is this something that you're seeing more often? It might be one of those things like, I don't know why this one person has problems with thrips and that person doesn't have problems with thrips. But every once in a while, we have been seeing russet mite or rust mites in tomato, and that has a very distinct symptomology. I'm not sure exactly how to describe it off the top of my head, but I know it's happening.
Yeah, and that is very distinctive. I mean, it sounds just like kind of like, I think what you were saying for the cyclamen damage. Like, yeah, I've seen tomatoes that almost look more like a russet potato, like that have very strange, just look very weird, and turned out it was mites.
Yeah, and it looks so much like a disease that it doesn't even cross somebody's mind that it might be a mite. And also it might be a mite that was introduced a couple of years ago and we just didn't know. And it grew and grew and grew over many years. That's just the fun and excitement of tunnel grown tomatoes, right?
Yes. Well, it keeps it interesting for the grower, and it's job security for the entomologists, right?
Right. Well, what makes it very funny to me that we're seeing such problems with rust mites in tomatoes is that same group, not the same species, but rust mites in apple and tree fruit, we always looked at as being beneficial, not because they were beneficial insects, but because they were food for the predatory mites that controlled red mites, right?
Oh,
so the European red mite that impacts apple production, having a really healthy population of predatory mites in those apple trees is like the name of the game, especially in East Coast tree fruit production. And keeping those predatory mites around, if they had something to eat, these rust mites, they almost never caused problems. They were great for them to have something to snack on when they ran out of European red mites to eat. So they were always looked at not only as benign in tree fruit, but kind of good to have around. I think it's a different species than the one we're talking about, but they're in the same group. I think they have a very cute look to them. They look a little bit like ice cream cones. They have a really interesting shape if you look at them under a microscope, but nobody needs to hear that.
It is interesting though. And somebody's going to search it now and go look at them.
Go look at them. Tell me, agree or disagree, cute or not cute?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, it's good to know. Nature is so fascinating. So, well, on that note, that's our list. And we spent another hour and a half talking about bugs, which was fun. But yeah, actually, I realized I have one quick question for you. I didn't realize that it was called cat facing on strawberries too. See, of course, I'm familiar with cat facing on tomatoes. And so is that just like applied as like blossom end deformities on a lot of different crops? Because I thought cat facing was specific to tomatoes, but you're talking about it on strawberries.
That's a really good question, because I think entomologists usually refer to cat facing as anything that results as damage that happens very early on in the fruit development where tissue grows around that damage. So like anytime I think about cat facing, I'm never thinking about like something that looks like a cat face. Right? So like you think about like the lips of a cat face. I'm thinking about dimples. I'm thinking about any kind of distorted growth that is clearly because of cell damage that happened because of feeding from a piercing sucking insect early on, and then that plant, that fruit grows around it and causes distortion. Mm-hmm. That's what I think of when I think of cat facing. So that's any fruiting crop. But I think other people might have something else in mind if they're thinking about cat facing, because it should look like a cat face.
Yeah, well, I would say I don't think most cat-faced tomatoes look very much like a cat's actual face, but just like it gives us a name to call the very specific deformity, you know?
Well, that's our homework, is to come up with a better term for that, because damage that happens early in the development and tissue grows around it. Dimples, that can be helpful, but it's never dimple shaped. It's usually something else.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to tell the difference between cat facing and poor pollination in a lot of circumstances, like especially with strawberry. I think like sometimes it's poor pollination and sometimes it's tarnished plant bug. It can be very difficult to tell the difference.
So take home here, do your scouting.
Yeah.
Because that's how you know, right?
That's what makes working with insects so easy, is oftentimes you can find them. You can catch them red mandibled or red proboscis.
Right. In the case of bugs who suck.
Bugs who suck. They're proboscis. They're tubes.
Right. Okay. Well, that was fun. I learned a few things, and I hope people can tune in and get some actionable ideas for what to do about the bugs that they wrote into us about. Is there anything else I should have asked you, or anything else you want to say about any of that before we let you go?
I think we covered a lot of curiosities today. Unfortunately, there's not a theme to any of these talks. It's more a matter of like, oh, this other cool thing about how bugs eat things.
Yeah. Well, that's good. That's good though, because if you're going to deal with all these things, you might at least just enjoy it's economically important to us for how to deal with them. And then a lot of this stuff is just kind of interesting, the way that the nature works. So I guess you don't have to appreciate the second part, but I think we had some good actionable tips for people of how to deal with these things that are bugging them. So okay. All right, Anna, where can people find you online or on social media, or wherever you want people to look you up in the podcast?
Well, you can definitely find out more about New Hampshire community supported research on our website, nhcsr.org. And if you're interested in the podcast, you can find us at Serious Grower on Instagram.
Yeah. Okay. Check it out. Those are some good resources, and I also like that you are often asking people for input about what they're seeing or like what they want you to look into. So I think that's very important. And all right, well, thank you so much for coming back to talk to us again, Anna. If you're interested, our first podcast with Dr. Wallingford, we went into the origin story, the background. So if that is quite interesting in his own right. So if you want to know more about Dr. Anna, I would say go check out that first podcast. Check out New Hampshire community supported research. Check out the Serious Grower podcast. And I'll just rely on you the next time there's big news in the bug world to let us know and keep us up to date on that stuff. Okay.
I'll do my best.
Okay. Well, thanks so much for coming back to talk to us again, Anna. I really appreciate it. And I think our audience will too.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Growing for Market podcast. If you've been enjoying the show, please consider giving us a follow and a rating or a review. It really helps others find the podcast. For more tips and tricks from farmer to farmer, check out our magazine at growingformarket.com. Whether you're a commercial grower or just want to grow like one, subscribe to Growing for Market magazine for the nitty-gritty of growing, marketing, and the business of market farming. We publish 10 issues per year with articles written by experienced farmers on topics ranging from tools and techniques to farm business operations and marketing. If you've been listening to the Growing for Market podcast and haven't yet checked out Growing for Market magazine, we've made a change so you can try the magazine for free. We've added a free month to the beginning of all first-time subscriptions. Try out the digital or paper magazine for a month, and if it's not for you, cancel within 28 days and you'll never even get billed. All subscriptions get you a year of the magazine, plus 150 downloadable back issues from the last 15 years and over 1,700 archived articles. With digital subscriptions starting at just $39 a year, head on over to growingformarket.com and subscribe today to benefit from over 3 decades of writing by farmers, for farmers, in Growing for Market magazine.